At the birth of the United States, we find a profound paradox. Men who declared all men are created equal, yet many of them enslaved others. These founders risked everything for liberty, envisioning a republic built on freedom. But their vision was tragically incomplete. Millions of enslaved African Americans were excluded from these ideals. The contradiction between the nation's founding principles and its reality is not just a historical footnote, it's central to the American story. How could a nation conceived in liberty also perpetuate slavery? How did the founders reconcile their ideals with their actions? Understanding this paradox is essential to understanding America, its triumphs, struggles, and the ongoing work to fulfill its promises. This is a story of both vision and moral failure. We're not here to simply condemn or absolve the founders, but to understand their complexity. By confronting uncomfortable truths, we can better appreciate the long journey toward a more perfect union. The American story is not one of simple heroes and villains, but of ideals, compromises, and enduring contradictions. To grasp this contradiction, we must look at the founders themselves. Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration, enslaved over 600 people, denouncing slavery in words but profiting from it in life. George Washington, too, was a lifelong slaveholder, only freeing his enslaved people in his will, an act that set him apart but did not erase his participation. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, owned slaves and saw slavery as a threat to Republican ideals, yet did nothing to end it. Patrick Henry admitted his hypocrisy, unable to justify slavery even as he benefited from it. Even Benjamin Franklin, later an abolitionist, once owned slaves and profited from their sale. Some founders evolved, but their early participation shows how deeply slavery was woven into the nation's fabric. Their stories are complex, full of contradiction and moral struggle. The founding generation's relationship with slavery shaped the nation's destiny. On July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence proclaimed all men are created equal. For colonists, these words justified rebellion against British rule and promised liberty and self-determination. But this promise excluded nearly 500,000 enslaved African Americans, who were treated as property, not people. The men demanding freedom from British tyranny denied it to others at home, a contradiction recognized even then. The Declaration also excluded women, who could not vote or hold office, and Native Americans labeled as merciless Indian savages. The new government was designed for property-owning white men, limiting the reach of its ideals from the start. The founders' vision required the displacement of indigenous peoples and ignored the rights of most Americans. The universal promise of freedom was, in reality, reserved for a privileged few. For most, the ideals of 1776 remained out of reach. The gap between promise and reality defined the nation from its inception. 11 years after independence, the founders met to draft the Constitution, aiming to create a stable republic. But slavery cast a long shadow over the convention. Southern states demanded protection for slavery. Northern delegates were divided, some morally opposed, but unwilling to risk unity. The founders faced a choice: create a union that included slave states, or risk no union at all. They chose unity, embedding protections for slavery into the Constitution. Debates were fierce. Some, like Gouverneur Morris, condemned slavery, while others threatened to leave if it was challenged. The final document avoided the word slavery, but included clauses to protect it. The founders hoped slavery would fade, but by protecting it, they ensured the conflict would endure. The Constitution was a political achievement built on a flawed foundation. The compromises made would haunt the nation for generations. The Constitution protected slavery through three key provisions. The 3/5 Compromise counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation, boosting Southern political power. The Fugitive Slave Clause required escaped slaves to be returned, making freedom elusive even in free states. The Slave Trade Clause delayed any ban on the international slave trade for 20 years, allowing the brutal importation of Africans to continue. These clauses formed a legal shield for slavery, woven into the nation's founding document. They ensured slaveholders' dominance in Congress and the presidency for decades. The Constitution's protections for slavery shaped American politics and society. The legacy of these compromises would fuel conflict and division. The founders were not blind to slavery's injustice. Many knew it was wrong. Patrick Henry admitted his guilt, and Washington called slavery his only unavoidable subject of regret. Jefferson condemned slavery's effects, fearing divine justice. Yet they prioritized unity over abolition, fearing that challenging slavery would destroy the fragile new nation. The Southern economy depended on enslaved labor, and leaders refused to join a union that threatened their interests. The founders made a calculated choice: compromise with slavery to preserve the Union. They hoped future generations would resolve the contradiction. In their time, they chose unity over justice, a decision with lasting consequences. The American experiment survived, but at a profound moral cost. The gap between America's ideals and its reality became a catalyst for change. Abolitionists used the founders' words to demand the nation live up to its creed. Frederick Douglass, in his famous speech, exposed the hypocrisy of celebrating freedom while millions remained enslaved. The struggle continued beyond abolition, through women's suffrage, the civil rights movement, and ongoing fights for equality. Martin Luther King Jr. called the Declaration a promissory note, demanding America honor its promise to all. The unfulfilled promise inspired generations to push for justice. America's ideals became both a source of shame and a rallying cry for progress. The journey to close the gap between promise and reality defines the nation's history. The fight for equality continues, fueled by the founders' own words. The founders' legacy remains hotly debated. Some argue their ideals were revolutionary, setting in motion a process of expanding liberty. The promise of equality inspired abolition, civil rights, and progress, even if the founders fell short. Others contend the system was designed for exclusion, protecting the power of a privileged few. The Constitution's compromises were not accidents, but deliberate choices to build a nation on inequality. For some, the hypocrisy is the defining feature of America's origins. The struggle for rights was not the system correcting itself, but a challenge to its very foundation. This debate shapes our understanding of American identity today. Can we separate the ideals from the flawed men who wrote them? How do we balance the founders' soaring ideals with the injustices they perpetuated? We must hold both truths. They gave us the language of freedom, but also protected a brutal system. Ignoring either side oversimplifies our history. The tensions of the founding, liberty and slavery, equality and exclusion, still echo today. Reconciling with this past requires honest patriotism, celebrating ideals, mourning failures, and committing to repair. We must tell the whole story, honoring both the founders' vision and the resilience of those who fought for freedom. The question of how to view the founders invites us to reflect on ourselves and our future. By confronting our history's complexity, we can better understand who we are and who we hope to become.